When Claire Bennett was dragged out of a charity gala in disgrace, Julian Kane believed protecting his empire mattered more than believing the only person who had never lied to him. But as a deadly conspiracy unfolded inside his own organization, he discovered that the quiet little girl who once handed him a silver rescue whistle had spent her entire life protecting him. Before this story ends, one heartbreaking secret will force a feared mafia boss to choose between his empire and the woman he should have trusted from the very beginning. Crystal chandeliers scattered warm light across the ballroom of the Kane Grand Hotel as St. Catherine Hospital celebrated its 20th anniversary. Doctors, politicians, philanthropists, and executives filled the room while a string quartet drifted through the quiet conversations. Claire Bennett stood near the stage in a simple navy dress, her employee badge resting against her chest. She had spent years protecting patients who had no one else to fight for them. Yet tonight, she felt strangely out of place among people who measured worth by titles instead of compassion. Before her award could be announced, Victoria Langford stepped onto the stage with a polished smile. "There's been a serious breach of confidential medical records," she declared. Every fork stopped. Every conversation vanished. Giant screens lit up with documents carrying Claire's name beside stolen files. Gasps rippled across the ballroom as security officers moved toward her. Claire didn't protest. She had learned long ago that panic only fed people who wanted to see her fall. Then she saw him. Julian Kane stood near the front beside board members and city officials, dressed in a perfectly tailored black tuxedo. 22 years had carved the lonely boy she once knew into the most feared man in Chicago. His face never changed, but his eyes recognized her instantly. For one impossible second, Claire believed he would step forward. He didn't. Instead, he gave the smallest nod to security. The officers approached with professional restraint. Claire slowly unclipped her hospital badge and placed it on the nearest table before looking directly at Julian. "The first time you walked away," she said quietly, "we were only children. This time, you know exactly what you're doing." Silence swallowed the ballroom. She turned and walked toward the towering glass doors without lowering her head. The cold night air hit her face the moment she stepped outside. Behind her, the doors had barely closed when another set burst open. A pediatrician sprinted into the rain, breathing hard. "Mr. Kane," he shouted toward the entrance, "3 children are dead." Julian froze. The medication Ms. Bennett warned us about. It was the same batch. For the first time that evening, fear crossed the mafia boss's face, and Claire, disappearing into the storm, never saw it. 22 years earlier, long before newspapers called Julian Kane untouchable, he was simply a frightened 14-year-old boy hiding behind an abandoned grocery store in Bridgeport. Rainwater trickled through the alley while bruises darkened his cheek. Everyone in the neighborhood knew what had happened to his family. No one wanted to be seen speaking to the son of a man whose name now inspired whispers instead of sympathy. Small footsteps broke the silence. A chubby little girl carrying an oversized yellow backpack stopped a few feet away. Claire Bennett looked at the blood on Julian's face, then quietly sat beside him without asking a single question. "My dad says people need help before they need answers," she whispered. She pulled a clean handkerchief from her backpack and gently wiped the dirt from his forehead. Julian stared at her, confused. Most children crossed the street when they saw him. Claire acted as though he were simply another kid who had fallen off his bike. Before leaving, she placed a tiny silver rescue whistle into his trembling hand. "It belonged to my dad," she said with a shy smile. "If you ever think nobody can hear you, blow this. Somebody will come." Julian closed his fingers around it as though it were the most valuable thing he had ever owned. "I'll give it back," he promised. "You don't have to." "I do." A week later, black SUVs rolled into the neighborhood before sunrise. Men in dark suits hurried Julian into the back seat. Through the rain-speckled window, he searched desperately for Claire. She stood across the street beneath a broken bus shelter, clutching her backpack with both hands. Their eyes met. Julian wanted to run to her. Instead, an older man shut the car door. As the convoy disappeared into the gray Chicago morning, Julian slowly turned away. He never saw Claire's father rushing toward another street only minutes later, trying to divert the killers who were still hunting the last Kane heir. By sunset, the city believed Thomas Bennett had betrayed the Kane family. Only the dead knew he had done exactly the opposite. The memory dissolved into the reflection of a glass elevator climbing the side of Kane Meridian Tower. Claire Bennett watched the skyline of Chicago disappear beneath her feet as the doors slid open onto the executive floor of St. Catherine Hospital's new corporate headquarters. Marble floors gleamed beneath soft lighting. Conversations stopped the instant Julian Kane entered the boardroom. He looked older than the boy she remembered, sharper around the eyes, dressed in a charcoal suit that carried authority without a single raised voice. The room rose to greet him. Claire remained standing only because she already was. "Ladies and gentlemen," the hospital president began, "Mr. Kane will outline the restructuring plan." Julian's gaze swept across the room until it reached Claire. It lingered for barely a heartbeat before moving on. "Ms. Bennett," he said evenly, "patient advocacy, correct?" Not Claire. Not the girl who had once handed him a silver whistle. Just Ms. Bennett. She answered with the same calm. "That's correct." Charts filled the screen as executives discussed budgets and efficiency. Then Julian announced that uninsured assistance programs would be reduced to offset rising costs. Several people nodded. Claire did not. "Those numbers aren't just expenses," she said. "They're children, veterans, and seniors who won't receive treatment." The room fell silent. One executive sighed. "We've already reviewed the projections." "You reviewed spreadsheets," Claire replied. "You didn't review lives." For the first time, Julian looked directly at her. His expression never changed, yet something flickered behind his eyes. She wasn't pleading. She wasn't trying to remind him of the past. She simply refused to let frightened families become invisible. "We'll proceed as planned," Julian said. Claire gathered a thin medical file from her folder and walked to the head of the table. She placed it in front of him. "Read this before you sign anything." He glanced down. "A new pediatric medication?" he asked. Claire met his eyes without hesitation. "If you ignore that report, the next death won't be an accident." She turned and left the room. Julian rested one hand on the unopened file. For reasons he couldn't explain, he didn't call anyone after her. He opened the first page instead. The report wasn't dramatic. There were no accusations, no emotional language, only dates, lot numbers, patient charts, and one sentence highlighted in yellow. "The manufacturing code does not exist in the official registry." Julian frowned. Claire had never exaggerated as a child. Somehow, he doubted she had started now. The next morning, icy fluorescent lights washed over the pediatric wing as alarms shattered the quiet. A young immigrant boy had collapsed moments after receiving medication from the very shipment Claire had documented. Nurses rushed between monitors while frightened parents stood frozen in the hallway. Julian arrived with 2 security officers at his side. Doctors instinctively stepped aside, expecting him to demand answers. Instead, he watched Claire. She wasn't barking orders. She knelt beside the child, pulling a marker from her pocket and sketching simple pictures on the corner of a clipboard. The boy couldn't explain his symptoms in English, but he pointed to the drawings with trembling fingers. Claire noticed his breathing change whenever the medication entered the IV line. "Stop the infusion," she said. The attending physician frowned. "Ms. Bennett, you're not a doctor." "No," Claire answered calmly. "But this reaction doesn't match the diagnosis. We don't have time for guesses." "This isn't a guess." Her steady voice cut through the panic. After a tense pause, the physician reluctantly ordered new blood tests. Minutes later, the laboratory confirmed a rare toxic reaction linked to the medication batch. The room fell silent. The boy's condition stabilized. His mother burst into tears and wrapped Claire in a grateful embrace, while the child managed a weak smile. Julian said nothing. He simply picked up the medication box from the bedside table. Claire pointed to a tiny printed code beneath the expiration date. "That production date never existed," she said. "Someone copied a real label but created a fake batch." Julian looked from the box to Claire. For the first time since returning to her life, he wondered whether the person he doubted was the only one who had been telling him the truth. Then his phone vibrated. A message from the hospital pharmacy read, "3 more cases. Same medication. Same batch number." Julian slipped the phone into his pocket without another word. Around him, physicians hurried through the pediatric wing while anxious families crowded the hall. Claire remained beside the little boy until his breathing steadied. Only after his mother smiled through grateful tears did Claire quietly step away, as if saving a child were simply another part of her day. From the end of the corridor, Julian watched her stop beside an elderly janitor struggling to lift a supply cart. Without hesitation, she rolled up her sleeves and helped him gather scattered towels before thanking him by name. "You remembered my birthday last month," the old man said with a grin. Claire laughed softly. "You told me your granddaughter was coming home from college. I figured it was worth remembering." No cameras followed her. No executives applauded. She simply kept walking. That evening, heavy rain covered Chicago in silver reflections as Claire drove the recovered boy and his exhausted mother back to their apartment on the south side. She refused the money they offered for gas. "Use it for groceries," she said. Across the street, a black sedan remained parked beneath a flickering streetlight. Marcus Reed lowered his binoculars. "Boss," he said quietly through an earpiece. "She never noticed us." "I wasn't asking her to," Julian replied. He ended the call before Marcus could ask another question. The following afternoon, another emergency reached St. Catherine. Julian's younger sister, Mia, stood trembling outside a treatment room, refusing to let anyone touch her. Every attempt to guide her inside only deepened her panic. Doctors looked helpless. Claire approached slowly, but stopped several feet away. Instead of speaking to Mia, she sat on the hallway floor and opened a worn adventure novel from the children's library. She began reading aloud. Minute after minute, the hallway grew quiet, except for her calm voice. Finally, the treatment room door opened. Mia stepped out with tears in her eyes. "I remember you," she whispered. "You're the lady who smiles at scared people." Julian felt something inside him shift. No amount of money had reached his sister the way a simple story had. That night, as Mia drifted to sleep, she looked toward her brother. "I hate hospitals," she murmured. "The medicine, it reminds me of the time someone tried to poison me." Julian's expression hardened. For the first time, Claire's warnings no longer sounded like impossible coincidences. The following evening, a cold wind swept across Chicago's waterfront as Claire sat inside a quiet neighborhood cafe, its windows glowing amber against the rain. Across from her, Daniel Price nervously wrapped both hands around a cup of untouched coffee. He worked nights at one of Cole Maritime's distribution warehouses, and every few seconds his eyes drifted toward the front door. "I shouldn't be here," he whispered. "Then why did you come?" Claire asked gently. "Because people are getting hurt." Daniel slid a folded shipping manifest across the table. According to the records, several pharmaceutical containers had entered the warehouse after midnight without passing through inventory scanners. Their identification numbers appeared nowhere in the hospital's official database. Claire compared the paperwork with the medication report she carried everywhere. The batch numbers matched. "If these shipments are real," she murmured, "someone built an entire supply chain outside the system." Daniel nodded. and everyone who asks questions gets transferred or disappears. Before leaving, Claire drove straight to Kane Meridian Tower. Julian was finishing a strategy meeting when she walked into his office without waiting for permission. Rain streaked across the glass behind him, turning the city lights into blurred ribbons. "You need an independent investigation," she said, placing Daniel's copies on his desk. "Not tomorrow, tonight." Julian studied the documents without speaking. The office door opened. Raymond Kane stepped inside with effortless confidence. "You shouldn't let old memories cloud your judgment, Julian," he said smoothly. "She's connecting random mistakes because she wants back into your life." Claire's jaw tightened. "I'm trying to save lives, and perhaps destroy a family business in the process," Raymond replied. Julian remained silent longer than Claire expected. Finally, he pushed the papers together. "I'll review everything." It wasn't yes. It wasn't no. It was another delay. Claire looked at him with quiet disappointment. Some decisions become answers all by themselves. She walked away before he could respond. Hours later, as thunder rolled across the harbor, her phone rang. "Daniel." His voice shook violently. "They know I talked to you." Metal crashed somewhere behind him. "Claire, don't trust." The line went dead. Only the echo of heavy footsteps remained. Claire stared at her phone for one frozen second before grabbing her coat. Rain hammered the streets as she drove toward the Kane Meridian warehouse near the harbor. Freight cranes loomed over rows of steel containers, their warning lights blinking through the mist. Before she reached the security gate, a black SUV slid across the entrance. Marcus Reed stepped out. "You can't go in." "I wasn't asking permission." "The warehouse is under Mr. Kane's authority." Claire met his eyes. "Then tell your boss people are hiding murder behind his authority." Marcus hesitated. Years of loyalty urged him to send her away, but the urgency in her voice felt impossible to fake. Claire opened her folder and spread several shipping records across the hood of her car. "Look at the timestamps. These containers entered after midnight without customs scans. These signatures belong to employees who were off duty." Marcus studied the pages. His expression slowly changed. "Who gave you these?" "A man who's probably running for his life." For several long seconds, only the sound of rain filled the silence. Finally, Marcus reached into his jacket and removed an access card. "You never got this from me." Inside the warehouse office, rows of computer monitors displayed shipment logs. Claire worked quickly, comparing inventory records with hospital deliveries. One entry after another disappeared from the official system, yet financial transfers continued through hidden accounts. Then she saw it. A digital authorization approving one suspicious shipment, authorized by Claire Bennett. Her breathing stopped. "I never signed this." Marcus leaned closer. "Someone copied your credentials." Before either of them could speak again, the office door opened. Julian stood in the doorway. His gaze shifted from Marcus to the files covering the desk. "I told you to stop investigating," he said quietly. Claire refused to look away. "And I told you innocent people were dying." For a tense moment, neither moved. Julian expected fear. Instead, he saw the same stubborn courage that had once belonged to the little girl carrying a yellow backpack through a rainy Chicago alley. He walked to the security terminal, entered his personal authorization code, and unlocked a protected section of the warehouse database. "You now have full access," he said. Marcus looked at him in disbelief. Claire blinked. It was the first time Julian had chosen trust over control. Neither of them noticed a security camera silently recording everything from the far corner of the room. By the following weekend, Kane Manor glittered beneath hundreds of warm lights as executives, investors, and charitable donors gathered for an elegant dinner. Crystal glasses chimed softly while a jazz trio played near the grand staircase. Claire attended only because Julian insisted the hospital's patient advocacy team deserved representation. She wore a dark emerald dress that was graceful without trying to impress anyone. Victoria Langford noticed the moment Julian welcomed Claire with the same quiet respect he offered board members. That was enough. During dinner, Victoria lifted her glass with a polished smile. "It's inspiring," she said, "to see how generous Mr. Kane has become. Some people are fortunate enough to enter rooms they never imagined." Several guests exchanged awkward smiles. Victoria's gaze settled on Claire. "Gratitude is important," she continued, "especially when someone's past creates opportunities they could never earn on their own." The room fell silent. Claire calmly folded her napkin before answering. "I've never asked to belong in any room," she said. "I only ask that truth is welcome there." A few board members lowered their eyes. Julian rose from his chair without raising his voice. He carried the empty seat beside him across the marble floor and placed it next to his own. "Claire isn't here because of her past," he said evenly. "She's here because she noticed what the rest of us failed to see." No one spoke after that. Victoria smiled politely, but behind her eyes, something colder appeared. Later that night, while guests departed beneath rows of black luxury cars, Victoria entered the mansion's security office alone. She inserted a flash drive into the surveillance server. Within seconds, selected camera footage disappeared. New footage appeared in its place. The edited recording showed Claire entering Kane Meridian's protected network at precisely the same time she had been sitting beside Julian during dinner. The timestamp looked flawless. The digital signature matched perfectly. By sunrise, anonymous copies of the recording had reached several board members, 2 city officials, and the hospital's ethics committee. As Claire drove to work beneath the gray Chicago sky, she had no idea that someone had already built the perfect case against her. Every piece of evidence pointed to only one suspect: her. Rain drummed against the glass roof of St. Catherine's annual charity gala as the ballroom filled with donors, surgeons, reporters, and city leaders. Spotlights swept across the stage while cameras waited for another celebration of Kane Meridian's growing influence. Claire walked in with quiet confidence, unaware that whispers had already reached every corner of the room. Victoria Langford stepped to the microphone before the evening's first award. "I'm afraid we must address a matter of public trust." The giant screens behind her flickered to life. Security footage showed Claire's credentials accessing restricted medical files. Financial records appeared beside them. Anonymous messages claimed patient information had been sold to competitors. Gasps spread across the ballroom. Claire stared at the screens, recognizing her own name, but none of the actions. "Those records were forged," she said. Victoria's expression remained perfectly composed. "Then perhaps the investigation will clear your name." Security officers approached. Claire turned toward Julian. He took one step forward, then stopped. Across the room, Raymond caught his eye and spoke quietly enough that only Julian could hear. "If you defend her now, the board will abandon you. The mayor will pull every hospital contract. Think before you destroy everything your parents built." For one painful heartbeat, Julian hesitated. Claire saw it. The silence hurt more than the accusation. Without resisting, she surrendered her identification badge and placed it on the nearest table. "I won't run," she said softly, "because innocent people don't have to." She walked toward the exit beneath hundreds of watching eyes. The ballroom doors had barely closed behind her when a pediatric specialist rushed inside, his face drained of color. "Mr. Kane." The music stopped. 3 children died within the last hour. He held up sealed laboratory reports. They all received medication from the same shipment Ms. Bennett warned us about. Julian snatched the folder from his hands. Every batch number matched the documents Claire had placed on his desk days earlier. He looked toward the doors she had just passed through. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice echoing across the silent ballroom, This gala is over. He turned to the security team. No one is to accuse Claire Bennett of anything until I have the truth. Outside, flashing police lights reflected across the wet pavement. Claire's car still sat in the parking lot. The driver's door was open. Her phone lay shattered beside a single drop of blood. Claire was gone. The abandoned warehouse smelled of cold steel and damp concrete when Claire opened her eyes. Her wrists were tied to a support beam, but she forced herself to stay calm. A few yards away, Daniel Price sat bound to a chair, bruised but alive. Beyond them, endless pallets of sealed medication waited beneath flickering warehouse lights. "You were right," Daniel whispered. "They've been replacing legitimate shipments for months." Claire scanned the room. Every carton carried the same impossible manufacturing code she had uncovered at the hospital. Footsteps echoed across the floor. Raymond Kane entered with Victoria beside him. "The hospitals panic," Raymond said smoothly. "Stock prices collapse. Investors lose confidence. Julian signs away control to save his company. Everyone believes he's making the sacrifice willingly." Victoria smiled. "History always rewards the people who write it." Claire lowered her eyes, pretending to surrender while memorizing every word. Across the city, Julian stood alone inside his late father's study. The shattered phone from the parking lot rested on the desk beside the silver whistle Claire had once given him. As he turned it over, something rattled inside. He carefully unscrewed the tiny cap. A tightly rolled strip of yellowed paper slipped into his hand. One sentence was written in faded ink. "St. Mark's Church. Beneath the altar. Trust Evelyn." Within minutes, Julian and Marcus reached the abandoned church on the edge of Old Bridgeport. Dust floated through broken stained glass windows as they lifted a loose stone beneath the altar. Hidden inside was a weathered cassette recorder. Julian pressed play. A woman's trembling voice filled the silent sanctuary. "If you're hearing this, my name is Evelyn Bennett. Thomas never betrayed your family. He learned Raymond planned the ambush. He drew the killers away so you could escape. We kept quiet because Raymond swore he'd finish what he started if anyone spoke." Julian's knees weakened. The recording continued. "My husband died protecting you. I may die protecting this secret. Claire agreed to carry the burden because she believed one day you'd deserve the truth." The tape clicked softly to its end. Marcus looked at Julian, but found no words. Julian closed his eyes, gripping the whistle until his knuckles turned white. For 22 years, he had hated the wrong family, and the woman he had abandoned had been protecting him all along. Claire kept her breathing slow until Raymond and Victoria disappeared into another section of the warehouse. The ropes around her wrists were tight, but the steel beam behind her vibrated every few seconds as forklifts carried pallets toward the loading docks. Daniel looked at her with exhausted eyes. "What now?" he whispered. "We stopped the shipment." She twisted the metal buckle on her belt until it snapped free, then used its sharp edge to wear through the rope. It took several painful minutes, but the fibers finally gave way. Instead of running, Claire crouched beside the warehouse control panel. Every emergency system inside the building was linked to St. Catherine Hospital's central network. She smiled faintly. They forgot who designed the patient alert codes. Using the maintenance terminal, Claire rewrote a routine fire inspection signal into a hidden message that only hospital administrators would recognize. She embedded the suspicious batch numbers inside the alert before sending it through the network. Across town, Mia Kane sat quietly in her hospital room when the notification flashed across a nearby monitor. The strange sequence of numbers looked familiar. "Those are Claire's codes," she whispered. She grabbed the phone and called Julian. At the warehouse, Claire activated the refrigeration backup system. Cold air roared through the storage bays. Within seconds, special security labels on the counterfeit medicine began changing color, revealing markings invisible at room temperature. Daniel stared in disbelief. "You just exposed every fake shipment. and created evidence they can't erase. Outside, black SUVs raced through the rain toward the harbor. Marcus gripped the steering wheel while Julian listened as Mia explained the coded message. "This isn't a cry for help," Julian said quietly. Marcus glanced at him. "No," Julian continued. "She's telling us exactly where to go." When they reached the warehouse, Marcus reached for his weapon. Julian stopped him. "We follow Claire's plan." For the first time since inheriting the Kane Empire, he chose trust over command. Inside, Raymond dragged Claire into the center of the warehouse and held her in front of him. "You've always been the dangerous one," he sneered. Claire reached behind her without looking and pulled the emergency release valve. White fire suppression foam exploded across the warehouse, swallowing the lights, the loading docks, and the counterfeit medicine in a blinding wave. Then the front doors burst open. Marcus led the security team through the haze while federal agents followed close behind. No shots echoed through the building. The thick white foam had already disabled the loading equipment and trapped every pallet exactly where Claire had planned. Raymond tightened his grip on Claire's arm for only a second before realizing the warehouse was surrounded. "You've destroyed everything," he hissed. Claire met his eyes without flinching. "No," she answered. The truth did. Julian walked through the drifting foam until he stood only a few feet away. For a long moment, he said nothing. His eyes rested on Claire's scraped wrists, then on the silver whistle hanging from a cord around his neck. Raymond laughed bitterly. "You still don't know who ordered Evelyn Bennett's death." Victoria took one frightened step backward. Daniel, escorted by 2 agents, lifted a waterproof drive from his jacket. "I do." The files contained payment records, altered hospital contracts, surveillance footage, and encrypted messages linking Victoria directly to Evelyn Bennett's murder, and Raymond to both the counterfeit medicine network and the ambush that had killed Julian's parents. Neither denied the evidence. They simply fell silent. Julian looked toward the waiting agents. "Take them." There was no revenge, no final threat, only handcuffs and the weight of decades of lies coming to an end. 1 year later, sunlight poured through the windows of the Bennett Community Health Center, built beside St. Catherine Hospital. Children filled the reading corner, while families received care regardless of their income. Claire stood at the entrance as executive director, welcoming every visitor by name. A reporter smiled at Julian. "People say she changed because you believed in her." Julian gently shook his head. "I changed because I finally believed the woman who had been telling me the truth all along." He turned to Claire and removed the silver whistle from his neck. "This belongs with you?" Claire closed his fingers around it instead. "No," she said softly. "Keep it." He looked at her, puzzled. "So you'll remember that real strength isn't being feared." A quiet smile crossed Julian's face. "It's listening." Hand in hand, they welcomed another family through the front doors, proving that kindness had accomplished what power alone never could. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment and let us know. When Julian chose to keep Claire's silver whistle instead of giving it back, it became more than a childhood memory. It became a promise that this time he would listen before it was too late. This story reminds us that trust is never built by words alone. It grows through the quiet choices we make when believing someone is difficult, inconvenient, or even costly. Today, think about one person in your life whose voice you've dismissed too quickly. If Claire's courage taught us anything, it's that the truth sometimes comes from the person everyone else overlooks. And listening today may change tomorrow. Have you ever wished someone had believed you sooner? Tell us your story in the comments. And if Claire's journey stayed with you, comment 1 below. There's another unforgettable story waiting for you in our next video.